Hello, everybody. This is Christine Waziedman. It is now on the hour, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Just to let you know, my colleague Kimberly is with me today. She will be monitoring the chat box. I won't be able to see what you're typing while I'm presenting, but Kimberly's going to answer questions as we go. And then if there are questions that are helpful for everyone, she will stop me and ask those questions so that you can all hear the responses to that. So just a little bit of housekeeping to let you know as we go. One of the things with using Importacular and iWave is that there are so many different options for where you can put this information, as well as what you have available to you. So for some of you, you may already have a contract with iWave where that includes support and the prospect destination. Others of you may have a contract with iWave that includes support, and some of you may not have either of those yet with iWave. That's something that you're looking at. I would encourage you to talk to iWave about your account. The other thing is that we do have areas that you can add on in addition to what you have with your contract with iWave. So if you're wanting to add actions or solicitors or organization relationships, just to name a few areas, those are all possibilities. You will see some of those things throughout this presentation, but I don't want to focus specifically on any of those. I really wanted to try and give you as many options as possible for things that the majority of our iWave clients are doing. So I'm going to focus on things within the prospect destination as well as some things within the free version or the version with just support, just because those are some areas that I know people are working with. So with all of that said, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And we can get started. So you should be able to see my Razor's Edge. I am on the plugins tab, which is how you access Importacular. So let's go ahead and click on Importacular and get started. I do want to mention while that's opening that I'm going to be working with a sample iWave report that I have saved on my desktop. So just so you can see, this is all fake data, so don't worry, I'm not giving away anybody's secrets, but you can see here that this is the data that I have pulled from this iWave sample. You can see we've got our pro score and our propensity and our affinity. We have all of our different capacity ratings, and then all the way into political donations, insights, and so on and so forth. So there's quite a few different things here. And one of the things that I encourage you to do as you're looking at your iWave data and as you're looking at what you're going to bring into Razor's Edge, there are a lot of fields here, and you may or may not want all of them in Razor's Edge. So as you're building your plan for how to use Importacular and Razor's Edge and iWave, I want to encourage you to really think about what of these fields you need in Razor's Edge to do good fundraising, and what of these fields you're going to use within iWave as you're building a profile and as you're looking at people one by one. So that's going to look different for every organization. And that's where I say that what I'm showing you today are just some options of things that you could do. And it's by no means to tell you what you should do, because I obviously don't know your fundraising and your database and your plans. So what I'm recommending today is that you sit down as a team with your prospect team and your major gift officers and decide what data is going to really make the most impact in Razor's Edge. And then use what I'm showing you today in order to map that data into Razor's Edge so that you can do your fundraising as you need to. So I'm going to go ahead and close the sample file. I'm assuming that most of you will be familiar with these areas and these fields. The other thing I do want to mention is that I have already set up my ratings. I've also set up an attribute to show you how you could track a rating if you don't have that prospect destination. If you are working with this for the first time, you definitely will need to work within Razor's Edge configuration so that you can set up your fields as you need to. So let's go ahead and select our file, because we're working with iWave data that's been exported into an Excel file. So I'm going to select File and click Start, and then it's going to bring up the option for me to find my file. So I'm going to use these binoculars here, and I know that my file is on my desktop, so that's where I want it, and here is my iWave sample file, which is what I want to work with today. So once I've got that, if you're working with an XLSX, you can go ahead and select what sheet. I've only got one sheet, so I'm going to go ahead and click Retrieve Data. So right now, my file for some reason is showing 999 records. I think that's something to do with how I saved it, but I know there's only 4 rows of data in my file. So I'll just go ahead and take care of that later. But I can choose from my templates here. And I do have an iWave specific template. So I'm going to select that. If you don't have a template, you would use the green circle with the white plus here to create a new template. But since I already have a template, I'm going to select the pencil so that we can edit and view our template. So you can see that that has popped up this screen with a series of tabs. Sorry, I'm stumbling over my words a bit. And on this first tab, we have our constituent information. All of this on this constituent tab is available to anyone using Importacular. The next tab we have is our address tab. Again, that's available to everyone. And then the other tab that's available to everyone is the gifts tab. So then in addition to that, many of our iWave users also have this prospect tab. So we're going to look at those tabs primarily today. As I mentioned earlier, you may find some of these other tabs helpful. And if you do, we're going to send you a link in the follow-up that lets you look at some video demonstrations of how all of the areas work. So you could see the actions or the solicitors, any of those things if those might be of interest to you. So let's go ahead and get started with our constituent mapping. When you work in Importacular, the first thing that you always have to start with is this constituent mapping. Now, mine is grayed out, and that's simply because I have already created a constituent mapping. So let's open that constituent mapping and see what it looks like. So you can see that we had to give it a mapping name. So I just named it iWave. You can name this whatever you want. Really what that name does is it allows you to go back if there's an exception or an error message when you complete your import or when you're validating your import. It allows you to go back and look and see where that was. So it's really just a marker for you to find things. The next thing that you can see is that we have 5 columns here. So the far left column here is what tells us if a field is required. And just as a side note, that's what is required in your version of Razor's Edge. So some things are required for everyone, and some things are required because your database administrator has made them required. So my database does have the first name field required. Yours may or may not. Then the next column is that Razor's Edge field. So this is where the data is going to go in Razor's Edge. So those names should look pretty familiar to you if you've been in Razor's Edge for very long at all. The third column is our source field name. So what that means is this third column is our spreadsheet that we've pulled from iWave, and it is those field names. So it's going to match exactly to those column headers. So if I click on my drop down here, you can see all of those same column headers that we saw when we opened that spreadsheet. So those are going to allow you to select those columns to match to this Razor's Edge field. The fourth column is a default value. So if you want to select something in Razor's Edge to be true for every record that you're importing, that's when you would use that default value. The last column is for field settings. So field settings and area settings are going to look really similar. Not to confuse you, I will show you area settings in just a minute. But what these field settings do is they allow you to make some changes to that field as you're importing it into Razor's Edge. So for example, you can see that I have some green here on my settings at the end of the first name row. That means that I have selected some field settings here. So let's open that and take a quick look. So you can see a couple things here. The first is that I have unchecked the box for existing constituents. I don't want to overwrite names on anybody that is already in Razor's Edge. I only want to update new constituents. If I don't want to make changes at all, I could uncheck both. If I had some conditions that I wanted to assign this only when something is here or ignore it, I could work with some conditions. The other thing I can do is if my file has some different casing in it, so people have typed in all caps, people have typed in all lowercase, and I want to do some corrections with that, I can use my casing here to make everything proper case. Just as a side note, if you do that proper case on the surname or the last name field, you do want to make sure that you go back later and check for last names that should have 2 capitals, such as O'Brien or McMillan or things like that. You may have to go back and make a couple of corrections with that. And then finally, on the field settings, we have what's called data transformations. We're going to look at those again later. Those are a way that you can dynamically change text and change data. The first name is not really a good field to show that on, so I'm not going to show that here, but we will come back to that later. So I'm going to go ahead and save this and close, and we can kind of keep scrolling down this list here so you can see some things that I've done. So one of the things that we have done here is that I've linked my constituent ID and my constituent import ID because we originally pulled all of the data in iWave out of Razor's Edge. We put those fields into iWave so that we could bring things back to Razor's Edge very easily. So because those are in my file, I've got those mapped, and that really increases our mapping ability within Importacular. If you're working with a file that doesn't have that ID or that import ID, or if you have some prospects that aren't already in Razor's Edge, Importacular does allow you to do a lot of matching with things such as the name or the address or email address or phone number. So there's a lot of other options within those criteria sets. I'm not going to be able to cover the criteria sets today, but just so you know, if you don't have those IDs and you're looking for how you match your people, search our knowledge base, search our user guide, and take a look at the criteria sets, and that's how you'll get that information. So you can see here that I've mapped quite a few of these different fields. And then finally, because I needed to add that primary addressee and salutation, I've selected default values there so that you can see those formulas and you can work with them and make sure that everyone has an addressee and a salutation. So I'm going to go ahead and save this mapping. And now you can see that we've got that here, and we've also added a constituent code. So once we're on this screen, now we can see we still have those red and green settings. So here, these are called area settings, and area settings in this regard allow you to work with that whole mapping. So if I click on these area settings for that constituent that we just looked at, I have a few options that I can work with that allow me to sorry, one second. That will allow me to work with that constituent. So if I had my whole name in one file, I could split that name up into columns, or if I needed to conditionally ignore someone, I could work with that as well. Those aren't really relevant to what I'm doing right now, but maybe you would want to use that conditional if you wanted to ignore someone who had an insight of not now. So I know that, or an interest, sorry. So I know that there are those insights of hidden gems, distinguished philanthropists, not now, and your champions. Well, maybe you don't want to add anyone into Razor's Edge that has that not now code. So you could use that condition here to say, ignore this constituent based on a field. And then you can say ignore when, and then we could scroll down and we can find those insights. And then we could say when the insights equal to, and then add that not now. So that's one way that you could use this conditional on those area settings so that you avoid putting people into Razor's Edge that don't have much interest. I'm going to go ahead and cancel that and continue to show you the different areas within our mapping. So because constituent code is a required field in my database, I have mapped a constituent code just to make sure that if I'm adding anyone new to Razor's Edge, it's going to be added. So I've just added that constituent code of friend, and you can see I've done that with a default value here. And because constituent codes also work with those date ranges, we can use our area settings to make sure that we don't add the same constituent code multiple times over. So I've got this set to not add a constituent code when there's an existing match, and to only add this constituent code to new constituents. So you can make that match based on just that constituent code, or you can also make that match based on the constituent code and those dates. So those are just some options that you have here to help you really build that data out. The next tab that I do want to briefly touch on right now is the address tab. So you can see here that I have mapped the address, the email address, and the phone number. just going to take a quick look there for you so you can see what that looks like. So you can see here, I've mapped all of those address fields. You could also fill in an info source and a date to and a date from if you need to. Again, I was working under the assumption that I pulled this information out of Razor's Edge to put it into iWave, so it's probably already in Razor's Edge. I linked it here just in case I needed it as a way to help match people. For instance, if their constituent ID has changed because we've merged an account in Razor's Edge, so now the constituent ID in iWave doesn't match Razor's Edge, if I have this address mapped, that can help me still link to the correct person. So that's why I've added that here, but also why I haven't added all of those fields. Same thing with that email address and the phone number. You can see here, this is mapped where we've got that email address coming from the source in the phone number field, and we have that phone type here for email. Again, those have area settings so that you can avoid adding some duplicates if that's something that you want to make sure you do. And there's a lot of different fields that you can work with there. I really would like to switch over to that prospect tab and show you some ratings and financial information and things there. So let's go ahead and leave our address tab and come over to the prospect, and let's start taking a look at that. So one of the things that we have available to us at first is this prospect mapping. So if you're familiar with that prospect tab in Razor's Edge, this works with the classification and the status. So you can work with that in order to take those insights and add those in as a classification. You can also add that status. So depending on how you want these people to be coded so that you can find them and know kind of what's going on with those records and those accounts. These two will allow you to do some segmenting and some searching there. I've linked my insights as a classification. That's that hidden gem. Oh, and there's nothing here. I've added that hidden gem and the philanthropists, the not now, the champions. And so what I could do is, if those don't exist in my list of they do exist in mine, I guess. I could map it to that. So if I could make them match, but you can see I do actually have those here. I've got a hidden gem and a champion right there. So you can also work with that to add new table entries, to make table entries inactive table entries active, or to ignore values. So if you're working with this and the code tables don't match, you do have a few options there of things that you can do in order to make it work. But if I wanted to, with my options there for like distinguished philanthropist, it's not on this list, but let's say that those distinguished philanthropists should become major donors. I can type in distinguished philanthropist, and I can change it to major donor. That's going to avoid creating another table entry there, but it's going to allow me to transform what's in my source into major donor. A couple of other things to note there is we do have a match type here of exact, word, or any. So if I just typed the word distinguished and didn't type distinguished philanthropist, I could use word, and then anything that said distinguished in my source would be transformed into major donor. Or if I used any, it would catch any version of the text that I had typed in. So if I had typed in just Phil, it would have caught it, whether it was philanthropist, Philip, anything like that, anything that had that PHIL. So just so you know, there's some options there. And then we do have a replacement type that allows you to choose if you want to replace the entire field or if you want to replace part of the field. That works more so with a text-based field. This is a table, so you really do have to choose an entire table entry. And then last but not least, we do have a catch-all. So what the catch-all does is it says anything that doesn't meet the criteria above, make it into this. So if I selected a catch-all and I chose annual campaign, what that would do is anyone who isn't a distinguished philanthropist is automatically going to be changed to that annual campaign. I don't want that for what I'm doing here, but that's just so you can see how that could work. So let's go ahead and close that. And I'm going to save this because I do want to keep that as it is. So the next thing that you have available here are proposals. So you can see here, I do have a proposal that I have set up. And what that would allow me to do is if I wanted to give my major gift officers some way to come back and track their progress with these people, with these prospects. I could add my proposal. I've worked with the date rated as the date scored. And then you can see here for the deadline on the date scored, I've used a transformation to say, I want the deadline to be 3 months from now. You do have some options here. You can change it from the number. You can also do the day, the month, the year. So if you wanted to do 1 year, you could do that. If you want to do 6 months, you have a lot of options. And that way you can work with that date scored and just project into the future when this proposal should be due. You can add that fund if you know what that is from the outset. You could put in some ask amounts if you wanted to work with one of the minimum or maximum amounts, something like that from the ratings. So we could come here and we could scroll down until we get to those amounts. I know they're here, but they always seem to evade me when people are watching me on the screen. I know that we've got some different amount. Oh, capacity range low and capacity range high. So we could choose to pick one of those. We could also choose to pick the high, and then we could use a proportion of the amounts. So we could say we want to do 75% of the high, something like that. And then that's going to change that amount dynamically for us as we go so that we don't ask anybody for that full high range of their capacity. So we've got a few different options there as you're setting up those proposals if you wanted to use that as a way to kind of set some goals and track some progress. The next thing here would be proposal attributes and notepads. So as you're building those proposals, if you've got fields that you need to add, you can absolutely add those. The ratings are the next area I want to show you. And I do have several ratings mapped. So you can see I've got a pro score, I've got a capacity, and I've got a capacity range. Those are all prospect ratings. So let's start with that pro score. So you can see that I have selected a category of pro score. That's something that I did set up in Razor's Edge so that I could work with this. I did create my pro score rating to work with a table. And my table has the entries of 1, 2, 3, and 4. So that description is the column in my data file that's labeled ProScore, and its data contents are 1 through 4. So this is going to allow me to import those directly to that rating with the 1, 2, 3, 4 as the description. The category is the ProScore. The date I'm working with is that date scored. And then the source I'm working with is iWave. I could have also added a note if I wanted to, but I chose not to for this demonstration. Next, I've got the capacity, and it's going to look really similar. So you can see again, the difference is that instead of the pro score, it's the capacity score, and the description is the capacity rating, but the other fields do look the same. Then I have the capacity range. So again, it's going to look the same here in that mapping as far as how I've set it up. The difference is just that the capacity range is a different table. So it's going to show those ranges that these users have indicated are based on, not the users indicated, but that the data on these clients, on these constituents has indicated that their range is. I've also tracked that the source of this is the iWave. And then the category I've used here is just their annual giving. So that's kind of a brief idea of how those ratings would work. The other thing that's a little bit further down are the financial information. So I've mapped a real estate holding here. So you can see that in our data file, we did have the median property value. So that's what I've listed. And then I've chosen the date scored. And then I've selected that information type as real estate holdings. I didn't add my source, so let's go ahead and add that source as iWave. You could also work with properties total value if you preferred to do that, or you could work with any of these other areas. So if you wanted to track the value of their political giving, if those are something that's relevant for you, you can work with that and you can add that in. So I'm going to go ahead and change to that because that does make a little bit more sense than that median. And I'm going to save that and close. The other option you have available here are the gifts to other organizations. The way that this report is coming through for me, I don't have an organization name. So that's why I chose to work with financial information. If you wanted to, you could work with these as an option if you wanted to add that information here, if that worked for your data structure. I just didn't because I don't have a specific organization name. I just have a lump that they gave to political or other things like that. So I'm going to go ahead and close that and leave that as it is. And then the last part of the options that you have here are if you have philanthropic interests. I didn't see that in my data file, but I know that with your iWave account, you very likely have more data than I do, just working with a sample. So if you have something that indicates something that they do want to give to or that they don't want to give to, that philanthropic interest and that will not give to are both available to you here. And you can select those and map it so that you can see what people are interested in giving to. And then finally, if you're working with the proposal, you can link to gifts, actions, and solicitors. Right now, these are grayed out because I don't have a gift link. I don't have a gift mapped. I don't have an action mapped, and I don't have a solicitor mapped. I don't believe that you would have gifts coming directly from iWave, so you probably wouldn't use that link, although it would be available to you if you had that information. The action link and the solicitor link would require you to have those respective data sources. So I know that I've walked through quite a few pieces here, but these are all with how you would track those ratings if you have this tab and this destination. And I know that not everyone does. So I do want to go back to our constituent tab and show you how we could build one of those ratings if you're working without the without the prospect tab. So I'm going to come back over to that constituent tab. And so what I have done is I've set up a rating as a constituent attribute. And I called it my pro score. So let's go ahead and give this a name. I'm just going to call it pro score attribute because that's what I'm going to do with that. So you can see here I've got my iWave pro score. And then I can come here and use my description. So I can come down and I can find my pro score. And my date here is showing in the UK, even though I'm working in a US sample database. So I'm just going to change that a little bit there just so that I know that I won't get a date exception. And then this is going to go ahead and just map that score as a constituent attribute. So if that's where you'd like to put those, the other option that you have available, you could work with a notepad. This is also available to everyone using Importacular. I don't have a specific type set up, but you could create a note type here. Let's just go ahead and select general for right now. We could work with our date scored here just in case we wanted to. And in our actual notes, we could put that pro score. So we got that option here. It's another place that you could put it. I personally prefer an attribute, but I do want to make sure I show you these as options. Another thing that I do want to make sure you're aware of as we're working with this is that this blue question or blue circle with the question mark in it, that takes you to our user guide. So if you're working in Importacular and you have a question about the area that you're in, anytime you click on this blue circle with the question mark, it's going to take you directly to that page within our user guide so that you can get a little bit of help on that area. I'm going to avoid saving this right now just because that's not what we need to show you for the moment. And I do want to go ahead at this point, and I'm going to save and close my template. Kimberly, if there have been any questions, I'd like you to let me know right now because I want to go ahead and walk everyone through how we match this data, look at the review screen and do a validation. So if there's questions about the template, this is a great time for everyone to type them in the box and for Kimberly to bring them to my attention. So I'm going to go ahead and save and close my template. And just one of those do as I say, not as I do. I definitely should have been saving my template all along the way. If I was building this from scratch, I definitely want to recommend that because I had already built and saved this template. I didn't do that today, but definitely recommend you do that on a regular basis. So now we're back to that screen that we started on a little bit ago. You can see your number of records. Again, mine is inflated. We can see what template we're working with. And now we need to give ourselves a control report. So anytime you're working with Importacular, you have to have a control report. That's how you can verify that everything has processed, or if something didn't process, it's how you can go back and figure out what's happened. So the control report is really simple. You're just going to click on the binoculars, select where you want to save your file to. So I'm going to save it to my desktop. And then I'm going to do control reports. And then just so I can remember which control report I'm working with, I'm going to name it iWave. And for good measure, let's give it today's date. Okay, so I'm going to click save, and that's all I need to do for my control report. Also, because I know that my file doesn't actually have 999 records, I'm going to choose to process just the first 4 rows. I know that I only have 4 rows, and that's really all I need for showing you all how this works. But if you're working with a large file and you want to do a quick test to make sure that your template works and you didn't miss anything, using this only process the first so many rows is a great way for you to do a really quick validation and test, just to make sure you didn't miss something that's required, such as a constituent code, or maybe your organization has a specific attribute and you need to make sure that's on every record. Using this will help you check that really quickly without processing all 999 rows. The next thing to point out here is that we do have the option to create a Razor's Edge query of our new and updated constituents. So I'm going to go ahead and check the box there. We could also create a query of exceptions. So that only works for records in Razor's Edge that we're updating. But if you're doing something and you want to be able to go back and find those exceptions for updates, that's definitely an option that you may find helpful. So once you have selected your control report, chosen the number of rows you want to work with, and chosen the option of whether or not you want to query, we can click continue. And that's going to go ahead and match our data in Razor's Edge to our data in the file. So mine went really quickly because of only having 4 rows. But you can see here, we now have a grid set up for us. So right now, all of my rows are set to update. The reason for that is because since this data came directly out of Razor's Edge to go into iWave, all of these people already existed in Razor's Edge, and we have matched them on their IDs. So you can see here, the grid at the top is the data in my iWave report. And then down at the bottom, we can see the record that's in Razor's Edge. So I can see Albert Smith with an ID of 240. And then down here, I can see Razor's Edge has Albert H. Smith with an ID of 240. I've got the same address. If I wanted to open his account, I can click on the orange Razor's Edge here. That's going to take me directly to his account. If I saw something I wanted to fix at this point, I definitely can do that, such as his gender is probably male since he goes by Mr. and his name is Albert. So I can save and close. That updates his account. If for some reason I thought that I needed to create a new record, or if I wanted to ignore a record, all I have to do in this dropdown is change the action to take. So it's defaulting to update because it found a match. But if I knew this was a brand new Albert, I could create, or I could ignore if I wasn't sure. When you ignore, what that does is that sends that record to the control report, and it just has an exception message of this row was sent and ignored. So you can always do that if there's something that you're unsure of or that you want to come back to later. A couple of other things on the screen I do want to show you. We do have the option to find matched constituents. You can search in Razor's Edge. You can also search in the grid. So for example, if we had Albert Smith in this grid twice, we could use that find in grid to make sure we linked him to himself and didn't create duplicates. We also have the option, if you're working with the individual destination and it's matching spouses, these match settings will help you work with those relationships. So especially with spouses, whether or not you add a new record. For right now, that's not something that everyone has available, but if that's something that you need, I just wanted you to be aware that it's possible. So the next thing I want to show you within this grid before we go ahead and validate is that this first tab is our data source, and it's showing us our action to take. But we can also click on our other tabs and we can access our data. So one thing that this is helpful is if we noticed that, say, Albert's name is spelled wrong, I could change his last name to Smythe very easily. I can type in this grid and change it. So these are fields that you can go ahead and edit, and you can make a change. So you can click in here and you can type as you need to. You can also check to make sure the data is populating the way that you thought. So you can see that we've added those primary addressee and salutation templates. We can see those are filled in. If I wanted to look at my ProScore attribute, I can just click on the rows down here and I can see those attributes and how they're populating. And I can also see my constituent codes and how those are mapped. I can see the same for my addresses. So again, I can type in here and make a correction if I need to. I can see my email addresses. So 2 of them don't have an email address, but that will not populate there just because the email is blank. And then we can also see our phone numbers. I did have a mapping set up in this template from something else that I was doing where I was linking the business name, if I had that, to an organization relationship. Didn't really focus on that during this call simply because that's not something everyone has available, but just so you can see, this is what that would look like. And because only one of these records has an organization name in the file, you can see that only one of them has an update where it's going to add that relationship. So it's already ignoring because the rest of them are blank. So again, if that's something that you would like to do or you'd like more information about, let us know. Otherwise, this is just to show you that when you have some other areas like the relationship, you do sometimes see 2 different columns of an action for whether or not it's creating a new constituent for that organization and whether or not it's creating a relationship. And then we can see all of our data that we mapped for that prospect tab. So you can see we have our classifications of hidden gem and your champion. We have our status of active for everyone. If we click on our real estate holdings, we can see that and how it populated. We can see our proposals for major gifts. So a couple of them don't have an amount at all. Because they didn't have an ask amount there. And so we've got that information there. We've got our pro score and how that plays out. We've got our capacity score, and we have our capacity range. So if you want to go through and see how everything looks before you import it, this is a great way for you to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and go back to my data source, and let's go ahead and do a validation before we do our import, since that's always our best practice. And that's going to go ahead and it's going to run through just like it was doing the import. And now we have the option to view our control report. So the control report has 3 tabs. The first tab has your properties. So you can see when you ran it, what time you started it, how many rows, where you saved that control report. All of the different information here about updates and creates, and if there were gift batches, if there were exceptions. And if it created a batch, what batch number it created. Since we don't have gifts, that's not relevant for us, but that is relevant for some other imports. The next tab would show us if we had any exceptions, which today we don't. All of my data on my template matched the way it needed to go into Razor's Edge, so that worked. And then the final tab shows a grid view of the template. So if you're trying to kind of identify where something happened, this may help you. If this makes sense for how your brain works, it may help you kind of get a sense of where you mapped information and what you named it and how it's linked. But if it doesn't help you, then you can always just ignore that tab. So I'm going to go ahead and close my control report. And now, because everything validated beautifully, I'm going to go ahead and import this for real. So we're going to uncheck that validate data box. We're going to import now. It's going to ask me if I'm sure, and I'm going to say yes because I have verified it. And now I want to create my static query. So let's call this iWave June 6th, 2020. We'll save that, and we're going to go ahead and do our import. So we've got that in. We can see it did the exact same thing as we did during our validation. We've updated 4 records. We can open our control report. It's going to look exactly the same. Nothing has changed. And let's go ahead and close that. And let's go ahead and close this, and let's open our query, and let's take a look at those records just so you can see how that information has gone into Razor's Edge. So I'm going to open my static query that I created. I just want to add some outputs so you can see my information. So let's go ahead and let's open Albert Smith first. So we can see that he's got the cell phone. He didn't have an email address. So remember, in that grid, it just said email and it had no email address there. So you can see that it didn't import a blank email address. You can see that it did not add a duplicate address. The address matched what was already in the system. So Importacular did not add a secondary copy of that address. You can see that we have imported that iWave Pro Score as a constituent attribute. And you can also see that when we come to our prospect tab, we have a classification of hidden gem. We have a prospect status of active. We have financial information. You can see I did a little testing there that didn't have an amount in it, but we do have the one that I just did today where I changed my amount. And we can see that he has that amount of over 1.3 million. So we can see those real estate holdings. We can also see that proposal that we've added today. So we can see that it has his identification, it's got a purpose. We've got all of this information that tells us what we mapped. And then finally, you can see the ratings that were added today. So we've got the pro score, the capacity score, and the annual giving capacity. So those are duplicated, and ideally I should have cleaned that up. That is something that sometimes happens when you do a bit of testing. So he's got a couple duplications there. I will need to go back and fix that. But if you only did this import one time, you would not have that duplication. The other thing that you can do to avoid that duplication that would be helpful is in that template, you can work with your area settings and you can use the date as a match tool so that you don't import the same rating on the same date, and that will avoid doing that. So that is something I should have done within my area settings, and I definitely would encourage you to do that when you set yours up so that you don't get that duplication. Just so you can see, let's take a quick look at one of our other records. Let's look at Beth O'Brien here. So again, the same thing, but this time we do have an email address, and we do have that attribute that we added to our mapping there. And again, we've got our general, we've got our financial information, and we have our ratings. So again, that same thing where I should have checked my area settings. But all of my information has gone in as I set it up in the template. Thank you all so much for joining us today.